Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Graham Mitchell. I'm a Infrastructure New Zealand board member. I'm here to introduce Andrew Weir, author and City Economist in the City of Melbourne. You know, we do follow Australia quite well, and Victoria and Melbourne actually does have the unfortunate trophy of being the longest city in lockdown in the world. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts their economic recovery. And people will be familiar, the state of Victoria has a bit of population of about 1 million more than New Zealand, but more interestingly, its economy is actually 50% larger than New Zealand. So I think understanding that impact of that economic recovery is important. Andrew is a policy expert and author who is passionate about searching the world for policy solutions that work, with degrees in politics, law, economics, and public policy. Andrew is a senior lecturer an Australian and a public servant who has worked for the national, state and local governments as well as the OECD. A graduate of the Senior Executive Fellows Program at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is also a Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration Australia. Andrew's first book, Solved: How Other Countries Crack the World's Biggest Problems and We Can Too, examines what has worked around the world and how we can apply those lessons at home. His latest book, Recovery: How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis, published in September of this year, explores how we recovered from the past crises and shows how these lessons can help us in the future after COVID-19. So welcome, Andrew, to his presentation.
Thanks, Graham. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Also take this opportunity to acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'd like to just provide some context for my talk today. I'm at the City of Melbourne. I started in that role in March of 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. I interviewed for the role back in January 2020 when the questions that I was peppered with were all about growth. Melbourne was one of the fastest growing cities in the developed world. Our economy was rapidly transforming to become a knowledge-based economy. And all of those questions were all about success. But by the time I started in March, that was the first week that everyone worked from home. I spent 9 months working on my kitchen table with a team of people I'd never met in the flesh for 9 months, working frantically, furiously, rolling out everything we could to try and keep small businesses afloat. There were tumbleweeds rolling down the main streets of the city. Businesses were shut. The risk really was that businesses would go under to a mass extent. And really, we did everything we possibly could. And working day and night, rolling out grant programs, trying to get ready to reactivate the city once we could. But ultimately, there was a point during that journey when it was time to stop and reflect and ask, beyond the present, beyond the challenges of the immediate circumstances, what was this crisis going to mean for the future of our city? What were the next 1, 2, 3, 10 years going to be like? How do you recover from a global pandemic? And there's no manual, there's no handbook for how you do that. And so the question that I pondered was, how might you form a view about how to recover from a COVID pandemic? And the insight, I guess, that I took was that learning from recoveries after other crises might be a way of generating some insight that would help inform our recovery ahead. So in my spare time, such as it was at 5 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock at night, I commenced the process of writing my latest book, Recovery. And that was all about interviewing experts, community leaders, public sector leaders, and others involved in recovery after war, pandemic, natural disaster, and recession, and really trying to assemble some of the insights that can help guide us in the months and years ahead. Because we do have quite a recovery ahead of us, and it's not just an economic recovery. It's also been a big health crisis, certainly in Australia. There'll be many health legacies of this pandemic, including mental health in particular, long COVID, impacts on the health system, etc. It's clearly been an economic crisis where we've had a substantial recession. There'll be significant structural impacts. It's been an education crisis. Children have lost many, many months of learning, and many have disengaged from education. Big challenges there, enormous challenges. But before we go any further, I just want to just really reflect on the question of what is a crisis. If you look at the dictionary definition, actually, it's not all bad. A crisis is a turning point, or a turning point for better or worse. It's the point after which things are different. And so it doesn't necessarily conjure up all negative consequences. And similarly, what is a recovery? A recovery is about thriving again after a crisis. It's back to what was before the crisis. It's actually working out how to thrive again afterwards. And many of you will be familiar with the disaster management cycle. And I think we need to think about our recovery in that context too. It involves a response, so putting out the fires or dealing with the health impacts of COVID, but then recovery. How do we deal with the aftermath? But then it's also got an element of preparation and becoming more resilient and ready for future crises. And as we think about the future, we need to be thinking about all those points in the disaster management cycle. So let me, as I went and talked to those experts and people involved in other recoveries, what I learnt was I also delved into the literature, read quite a lot of the academic reports, pulled out a lot of the data and the evidence, tried to look for those common themes, and I also grappled with the question of intersecting challenges. Many inevitably intersect with other challenges: future natural disasters, climate change, inequality, geopolitical tensions. All of those things shape recovery. But overall, what I learned was that after a crisis, it is quite possible to recover well and to build a better and brighter future. Many of those places that I looked at bounced back to become much better than they were before. And I think there's really good reason for optimism for what comes next after this crisis. Upon two specific case studies. There's many more that I looked at, but I'll just do a couple to whet your appetite, I guess. The first is the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the response by the Roosevelt administration in the form of the New Deal. The Great Depression was a horrible, terrible tragedy, really, precipitated by the 1929 stock market crash. And millions of people wandering the United States in search of work. It ultimately wasn't just a United States phenomenon, but it originated there and was most impacted there. Thousands of people were living under cardboard or tin in shanty towns. Capitalism appeared not to be working. There were people starving, but crops were left rotting in the ground in this weird sort of falling apart of the way the market system worked. Steel plants were operating at just 12%. 5,000 banks crashed. Million people lost their jobs. Unemployment rose to nearly 23%. And output, that's GDP effectively, that fell by 52%, by half, between 1929 and 1933. It was an incredible, incredible time. Roosevelt was elected in the middle of this and immediately began working to sort out this crisis, sorting out short-term aid in the form of food relief and blankets and that sort of thing, sorting out the banking crisis fairly quickly, but then moved to a medium-term footing, introducing industrial codes such as minimum wages, maximum hours, child labour, collective bargaining, massive infrastructure program. So the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Project, the Lincoln Tunnel, LaGuardia Airport, San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge, all of those projects that are still really important pieces of infrastructure today originated in that New Deal approach. There was the Social Security Act, which introduced a permanent system of retirement pensions and welfare provisions. Interestingly, though, there was never really a master plan for the New Deal. There's a real approach of drawing on expert advice, expert advisory panels of economists and lawyers and trade unions, but also inviting the broader society at large to try and fund, and things were funded to try lots of different iterative experimental approaches to the crisis. Those that worked were scaled up; those that didn't work were pulled. And it was extraordinarily successful. There was 8% growth between per annum between 1933 and 1937, the fastest ever growth outside of wartime, back to 1929 levels of output by 1936. And employment rose to 1929 levels by 1937. So recovery happened eventually. Interestingly, there wasn't a lot of economic stimulus at the time. This was before the whole Keynesian approach to economic stimulus. Um, but there was a lot of confidence and optimism. Roosevelt had these things called fireside chats where he'd sit down regularly with the people and take them into his confidence, explain what the plan was. And that there's some academic studies that show that increase in confidence, which was a direct consequence of political leadership, that confidence drove 3/4 of the recovery. Quite an interesting thing, I think. And there's an enormous legacy of the New Deal and the recovery from that recession that still persists. It reconfigured the role of government in the United States. The notion that government has a responsibility to look after people in their retirement through old age pensions, in unemployment insurance, subsidized public housing. Those things didn't exist before the New Deal. Labor protections that are still in place today originated then, and much of the infrastructure that we talked about. And also, I think it's worthwhile reflecting that the out in the New Deal went on to have an enormous transformational impact on the city, on the nation. Roads, and electricity enabled suburban development built around cars. You had investment in things such as sewerage programs. So Atlanta's sewage system was impacted. It was built during the New Deal, and that enabled massive growth of the American South that wasn't happening beforehand. So you see the rise of the Sun Belt today in the United States originated through much of that recovery activity after the Great Depression. I'll just turn now to one more example, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Aceh, you will all remember this example. In 2004, Boxing Day tsunami, one of the biggest natural disasters of all time, really. There was this impacted many countries around the Indian Ocean, but the epicenter of that crisis was Aceh on the tip of the Sumatran Peninsula in Indonesia. The tsunami involved waves of between 6 and 9 meters high. When you think about that's 2-story building height. In some places, the waves were measured at up to 51 meters high. That's the size of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Houses within 2 to 3 kilometers of the coast were swept away or destroyed, absolutely flattened. If you go to Banda Aceh, there's a giant cargo ship resting in the middle of the city, 3 kilometers inland. There's a fishing boat 25 meters long sitting on tops of houses. So 167,000 people died and 110,000 houses were lost and 500,000 people totally displaced. It was devastation. I spoke with Dr. Kuntoro Mangkusubroto, who's the Indonesian government's head of the Aceh Nias Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Agency after that crisis, and talked me through that approach to what was effectively the biggest reconstruction and recovery effort in humanity's. It involved absolute billions and billions of dollars of aid money, 800 not-for-profit agencies from all around the world converging there. And importantly, this approach involved a partnership between national government and regional government, and governance arrangements that brought the 800 aid agencies basically into the fold to ensure that it was a coordinated, coherent approach to recovery. One element of reconstruction, of course, was peace. Aceh had experienced nearly 20 years of civil war. They practiced quite a more conservative form of Islam than the rest of the country, and there was a secessionist movement. And until peace came about, recovery was really not possible. Many of the guerrilla fighters up in the mountains, though, had relatives down in the lowlands who they wanted to help. Mangkusubroto, who I spoke to, said that basically until peace, the aid agencies weren't comfortable coming. You couldn't have aid agencies at risk of being shot. And so peace was a driving imperative of the recovery process, and that was ultimately brokered. And that was a really key part of the recovery process. Another dimension to this approach was community-led recovery. That was right at the heart of approach to recovery in Aceh. It was an explicit decision of the agency and of government. And what that meant was that there were facilitators working with each village, for example, bringing together all of the villages together, working out who owned what parcel of land where because all the markers had been washed away, and getting them to agree amongst themselves, coming up with a vision for the future of the village. Did they want a school? Did they want a mosque? Where would it go? Where's the land? And not until plans for the village were signed off by the villagers would any reconstruction happen. It was had to involve the leadership of the community in coming up with solutions. Really critical point. Another dimension was building back better. And Bill Clinton was the United Nations envoy to Aceh. He worked with Mancusobroto to coin that term, building back better. And it was building back better in every sense. It was a sense of better infrastructure, in terms of stronger communities, in terms of environmental resilience, all of those things that really were at the heart of, if you're going to build back, you need to build back better. And it was an enormous effort at recovery. 140,000 or more houses reconstructed, 3,600 kilometres of road, 1,700 schools, 1,100 health facilities. But one of the key dimensions that Mancusobroto spoke to me about was the absence of economic development. Once the reconstruction money left, there was very little private sector economic activity left behind. At the port of Aceh, 99% of the produce going through that port is coming into the province. Only 1% is actually leaving because Aceh doesn't have a particularly strong private sector economy. And almost every recovery that I explored, that was a common theme. They wish they had have invested more in developing a stronger private sector economy to actually drive recovery, not just in the immediate months and years after the crisis, but in the decade ahead. That economic recovery, thinking about that over the decade, is absolutely critical. There are clearly some things we need to think about, and I'll try and draw this together relatively quickly. Over the short term, we're going to see an enormous bounce. There'll be pent-up demand. We see that everywhere after crisis. People rush out of the blocks and spend money. You see a short-term bounce in recovery, in growth. But it's not clear, though, whether that growth will be sustained. And we need to be thinking about growth over the next decade or so. Certainly in Australia, we managed the global financial crisis really well, but then we had a decade basically of flat wages, flat productivity growth. We want to see something after the World War I and the Spanish flu in the United States, and much less like the decade we saw after the global financial crisis. Economic development clearly makes a massive difference in that regard. We know there's going to be political impacts of the pandemic. One argument is that the rise of Trump and Brexit was a consequence of the global. We don't quite yet know what the political impacts of this crisis will be. There'll be disruptions to the geopolitical order. Some countries have done better than others out of this pandemic. We know there'll be lasting social consequences. Changes in gender relations have been a big feature of crises in past. In this example, we know there's the nature of work, the future changing nature of work, and consequently the way our cities function is probably going to be one of the consequences of this pandemic. There'll be consequences such as mental illness. We also know there'll be future crises. In Australia, as we hit this pandemic, we were still recovering from East Coast bushfires. There will be future crises. We will need to grapple with them exactly as we're recovering from this crisis. More fundamentally, there are some serious big underlying strategic issues that we were grappling with before the crisis, and we will need to continue to grapple with as we recover. Climate change, both a massive threat and a massive opportunity. Inequality, really undermining the success of everything we do economically, socially, etc. Some challenges around geopolitical issues, for example, the relationship with China. And so some big questions we're going to need to grapple with as we think about recovery. So let's have a look at the roadmap now. Let's just pull together a few themes as we generating the insights from all the recoveries I looked at. It really seemed to me that there are some key things we need to think about. And I'll race through these. One, we need to set up the recovery. That means the right governance arrangements, partnerships between local government, regional governments, national governments, other organisations. The right governance arrangements need to be in place. We need an inquiry. We need to make sure that we not just point the finger and apply blame to who did what wrong, etc. But we need to make sure that we capture the lessons of crisis, so that we can actually then ensure that for posterity we have a record really of what we've learned during this crisis, and then some recommendations for what we can put in place to ensure that we're improving things for future circumstances. Economic stimulus is going to be needed for some time, many years, in fact. We don't want to be like the United Kingdom after the global financial crisis and move back to austerity too quickly, leading to a decade of stagnation. We'll need to think about adopting an experimental and creative approach. None of us have got all the answers here. We need to be iterative and experimental. Economic development will be absolutely fundamental, not just over 6 months, 12 months, but over a decade. We need to be asking the question such as, nation going to be famous for? What are we going to be really good at? Investing in education, obviously it drives growth, social determinants of health, national conversations about difficult issues, such as peace. In Australia, it'll be about Indigenous dispossession and reconciliation, preparation for future crises. There's clearly a role for all of us here: governments, local governments, community groups, business. All of us have got a massive role to play, and we all need to work together and keep this conversation going ultimately. I'll leave it there because I've gone a little bit too long, but great.
Thanks, Andrew. That was really interesting, particularly all that analysis of the previous global crises and how people have recovered from those. And some of that centres around sort of a lot of what we're actually focused on as well here. So some of the things I was going to touch on with Andrew is basically infrastructure, particularly in Victoria, and the relationship between the City of Melbourne and the state, because I think that's quite important in the New Zealand context, particularly in the Auckland context. So I was going to touch on that, and if some other people can flick through some questions, that would be good. And I think the other thing is how they're actually going to respond quickly to the recovery as a city, and what lessons that they can bring for that sort of recovery to Auckland, because Melbourne is obviously a larger city, but geographically we're of a similar size, and I think that's quite important. And I think the other thing which I chatted to Andrew about before we came on was how they are seeing the impact of COP26 in the Victorian context and in the city context there, given their high dependency on mining. You're back, Andrew.
I am, and I heard most of that, Graham. So
yeah, that's all right. That's okay. You should have built ultra-fast broadband and fibre to every home in Melbourne rather than the NBN would be our advice.
Could be good advice, I suspect.
We should probably think here with. So we touch on the infrastructure point, because you mentioned, and obviously the New Deal with Roosevelt, and you mentioned that even an Arche is big components of that is infrastructure recovery, which obviously is building back better and building for recovery. And the key sort of thing that I think our audience will be interested in is, as a city, which is quite a sizable city, how do you influence the big infrastructure funders in Australia to bring that infrastructure to your city, particularly the state, obviously, and also the private sector? Because as a city, you've been reasonably successful at that, and in the recovery, that's going to become even more important, I would have thought.
Yeah, well, certainly in a city like Melbourne, where I'm from, we have an independent infrastructure agency providing assessment of infrastructure needs and requirements. That's Infrastructure Victoria, and that provides effectively arm's length advice back into government. We also have quite a good constructive working relationship between the City of Melbourne, where I work, and state government in terms of identifying a strategic framework for growth and development in the city. So I think ultimately, though, we need constructive collaborative relationships between all tiers of government and a common vision. And I think it's hard, but we're going to need to stay focused on growth and development over the medium to longer term, and not just the short term economic development. Infrastructure is often thought of at a time like this as an economic stimulus term, which it is, but ultimately infrastructure is also about setting up a city or setting up a nation for economic growth over the medium to longer term, and that's where it matters. For example, there's a great illustration, I think, in New York City after the global financial crisis, which was the epicenter there. they determined that a key function of their economic recovery was diversification away from financial services. They needed to invest in engineering capability. And so they put out a global expression of interest process for a new university on Roosevelt Island in the Hudson River. And we're investing $100 million to establish a new campus. But that was less about the building of the new campus, which was a big part of it, but it was fundamentally about contributing to building out to ensure that there was a major technological capability in the city that would rival an MIT or a Stanford in New York City as a fundamental driver of economic growth over the medium term. And I think that's the type of thinking that our cities are going to need to work through.
Yeah, it's sort of using hard infrastructure to deliver quality social future infrastructure, if you want to sort of look at it in terms of an economy and things like that. One of the questions that's come up is, how does the City of Melbourne's COVID recovery plan align with the outline steps that you've presented?
Yeah, I think we've had a couple of goes at recovery actually in the City of Melbourne. We were in lockdown for quite some time, and then it was recovery or reactivation of the city, and then we're back into lockdown. Hopefully now we're back into reactivation and recovery for some time. There's been a big focus at the City of Melbourne on I guess an iterative experimental approach using artists in particular as a way of breathing life back into cities and trying all sorts of interesting experimental things. I think it's still a bit too early though to focus on to determine how well we've gone in relation to a lot of the other things. They're big strategic long-term things, and we're really being in the moment of grappling with crisis. We're still got 1,000 cases a day in Melbourne of COVID, and we're first taking our first baby steps to come out of the crisis. So I think Melbourne's well on the way. It's certainly thinking and asking itself really around all those questions around long-term economic growth. We've got an economic development strategy that we've developed as a city, which has a 10-year focused on those questions about growing knowledge-intensive sectors that are going to improve productivity over the medium term. Infrastructure as a driver of growth is right at the heart there. But there's certainly a lot of conversations still to be had about recovery, both at the city level, but also with other tiers of government as well.
Yeah, just sort of staying on some of the themes, how has the City of Melbourne's integrated sustainability and social impact into its recovery plans?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've taken some of the opportunity during COVID to implement some infrastructure initiatives and sustainability initiatives that would have been many years in the making otherwise, but accelerated the delivery of those during the crisis. So we've, for example, rolled out 40 kilometres of separated bicycle lanes through the middle of the city to improve access to cycling in the city. We've planted 150,000 trees during the pandemic as part of our urban forest strategy to reduce the heat island effect.
Mm-hmm.
So we've expanded pedestrianisation of many of our smaller streets in the centre of the city. We've built out footpath capacity. The biggest congestion issue facing Melbourne before the pandemic was footpath congestion, and so we've actually expanded footpath capacity in many instances. So the thinking through that and the delivery of that during the pandemic, when the city's been a bit quieter, has actually been a real focus.
And, as a city sort of similar in Auckland to a way, how have you assessed that sort of impact on those much smaller businesses like, your cafes and your hospitalities and that, like in your little columns and your laneways, which have clearly been closed a long time, the very small businesses, and how's the city going to go about to try and attract support to those businesses to get people back? Because they're the ones that have really suffered.
Yeah, the City of Melbourne's unique. We're only 37 square kilometres in the centre of Greater Melbourne, and on any given day prior to the pandemic, there were 1 million people in the centre of the city, of which only about 180,000 lived in the city, and the rest were effectively itinerant, transitory workers or visitors moving in and out of the city, and that's basically diminished enormously since the pandemic. Even yesterday, there were 60% fewer pedestrians on the street compared to pre-pandemic levels. And those businesses that rely on pedestrians or visitors, such retail, hospitality, personal services, etc., they are really struggling. And our task really is to activate the city, getting as many people back as possible, giving them confidence to return, generating momentum, I think, is our task as a city. So we've been doing things like we have a rebate program on dining in the city during Monday to Thursday, where you get 30% back on your meals. With many events, we've got our artists to activate laneways, to do installations there to make it attractive. We've done all sorts of things that enable that do what we can to make the city an exciting and attractive place to visit. But there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Andrew. And I'd be personally a very strong supporter of hospitality rebates in our city, which no one's actually done yet, because I do think that would have a big impact. Okay, well, thanks very much for your session. I think that brings us to a close here, and the next session will be starting shortly. So thanks, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, Graham.
Okay.
Really, and thanks everyone for having me. Great.
Okay, kia ora.
Great day.